know such, and from your perspective, you had mentioned earlier about seeking consent and involvement from Indigenous communities. Now, how would it be feasible to include Indigenous representation and Indigenous decision-making power within the psychedelic renaissance, especially with regards to companies that are actually developing psychedelic therapies from heritage molecules?
Mm-hmm.
Is that feasible? Is there an interest? How do you do it? Curious to know your thoughts.
Yeah, this is a very interesting and deep question. I think one, the way that the question is framed is interesting to me, right? Because I think we actually have to reframe that, how we look at it, right? I think it's how can we support bioculture conservation unequivocally, empower Indigenous peoples who are protecting the medicine, the land, who are the experts that then can influence the psychedelic renaissance, right? I think that what's happening is there's a lot of tokenism that's happening. And we've seen this repeat time and time again when we look at the land grabs that happened and the treaties that were signed and the one native person, right, who decided to put their thumbprint on a treaty that impacted an entire community, right? And so I think that, there are many organizations that have been dedicated to the bioculture conservation of land and these medicines and the protection of this knowledge for generations. So we should start there. We should start there and unequivocally get behind those communities and allow them to lead. Like Joseph said, this amazing Indigenous-led ayahuasca conference that's happening, right? And what our responsibility to do in this psychedelic sector and industry is listen to the recommendations that come out of those spaces, right? And so when we hear this introduction of, reciprocity, and it seems like it's a new buzzword, and people are just now beginning to learn about, the Convention on Biological Diversity and ABS, access and benefit sharing. This was put into place in 1992. It's the year before I was born, right? It's been around for a long time. It's been here, but people are choosing not to listen. People are choosing to say, it's so hard to do consultation. I don't know who to speak to get representation. That's a lie. That's a lie. We see the work that's happening. You're choosing not to listen. You're choosing not to consult, right? You're choosing to center capitalistic frameworks and the urgency of raising money before prioritizing community, because consultation and listening takes time. We move at the speed of trust, but capitalism timelines and exploitation timelines will very different than our Indigenous protocols and ways of being and knowing, right? They're not in sync. They're in direct opposition of each other. And so I think, it is feasible to include Indigenous peoples in decision-making power, right? But we're thinking about it backwards, right? How can they make decisions in our movement? No. This isn't the psychedelic movement. We need to reframe it. And this is a land back movement. This is a bioculture conservation movement, right? And I think when we begin to recognize that, we have an opportunity to really, really empower, like Joseph said, like Shanae said, empower Indigenous peoples to lead what we've always led, right? Right. And, where I see the big gap is, when we look at philanthropic funding and where it's going, 0.4% is going to Indigenous-led initiatives, right? But then I'm seeing some company raise their, put their press release that they raised $20 million to commercialize heritage molecules or the botanical when we know there's an ecological threat, right? So I think it really comes down to the sustainability and the decisions we're making and how we're viewing Indigenous peoples, right? We're not just a token. We are experts, in our traditional knowledge. We are experts in caring for the land. And such, we need allies to get behind us, right?
There can be a pretty broad spectrum of communities that use certain plants. So for example, there are hundreds of Indigenous communities that consider ayahuasca to be part of their cultural heritage. So I wonder about how it's possible to garner agreement among these different parties. So, for example, a company like Filament Health that has developed the world's first ayahuasca pill. How could they meaningfully seek Indigenous participation or engage in Indigenous empowerment? And which nations should be the beneficiaries of such an initiative? Joseph, any thoughts about that?
Oh, I think I might have to pass that off to Sutton and Shanae, but I'll just say I don't know if it's even right to approach this with like the goal of garnering consent from people. I think that's kind of like a backwards way of thinking about the issue. I think the truth is that Indigenous communities are diverse. There's no monolithic organization that can tell you, especially like you just mentioned, all of the different nations that consider ayahuasca medicine are not all in agreement. And there are declarations that you can read from Umiak, from different Indigenous organizations, where they very strongly declare that ayahuasca should not be used in this way. And then there are others who have a different point of view. I think, like I said before, my goal is really to support those communities in building their autonomy, because then when they are asked and when it is when they're approached with the goal of some relationship being built, they're coming from a position of empowerment, of strength, stability, so that they can decide how that's going to go. I think companies that are trying to garner consent or consultation have to recognize where they're coming from. So any Western company, an NGO, a nonprofit, they're all coming from a position of power, where they are coming from an economic position where they have more resources and more money, more funding, more political capital than the Indigenous communities that they're supposedly building a relationship with, coming to an agreement with. And agreements, contracts, they're all based on this idea that two parties are on equal footing agreeing about something. But the truth is, even when you're negotiating your salary with an employer, you're not from the position of power is the employer. They're dictating the terms. You need the money. You have to live to support yourself and your family. That's the position that communities are in, especially like we mentioned the Yawanawa earlier. One of my partners, Yawanawa Sociocultural Association, their territory right now, the Rio Gregorio, is experiencing catastrophic flooding, like that they haven't seen in decades. It's destroying entire communities. And if somebody wants their consent to extract something, they're fighting for their lives right now. So it's a bit of I think that has to be addressed first, and then you can talk about a business arrangement. But I don't think there's a good answer to that question as far as whether it's right or wrong. I think it's more about what I think, with Erie, we like to always remind ourselves that Indigenous medicines like ayahuasca, the knowledge that surrounds them, the communities that hold those medicines, that is the basis for that medicine, right? So without the human rights of those people, of that community, of that environment, there won't be that knowledge and there won't be that medicine. So how do you respond to that? Is that you center the political struggles of Indigenous peoples, of local peoples, because you recognize that the struggle for autonomy at the grassroots level is the basis for these medicines and for this knowledge. And so I think when I look at the psychedelic community, when I look at like pharma companies, people that are wanting to get some cosign or some sort of like consent to do what they're doing, I think they need to maybe take a step back. But at the same time, I don't want to be naive and say, and wait for that to happen. I'm not holding my breath. I think the incentives are too strong to privatize things, to commodify things, because our economic system operates based on the fact that if you can privatize something, it's more profitable. So that's what happens to, forget our these precious sacred medicines, but like our water, people are incentivized to destroy public water, so that then the only way that people can get their water is from a private company. That same principle is applied across the board to not just water, but food and land and medicine, all of the resources that we need. And, you know, I think it's a hard question to answer, but yeah, I want to just, I try to think practically and pragmatically, but yeah, I think there's a perspective from, you know, one of my other partners. I also partner with the Mazatec in the Sierra Mazateca in Mexico. And one of my partners was asked, Heriberto Prado Pereira, there's a video that we made with him about mushrooms and whether it's okay that companies are making psilocybin pills and stuff. And he just kind of tells a story about the mushroom collector in the Mazatec tradition, goes to the mountainside and picks a wild mushroom. That is a different context. He doesn't say it's better or worse, but that's the context where that comes from. And then if you're growing mushrooms in a basement, that's another context. That context is informed by all the relationships around it. And it's just an invitation to think about that. And I think companies like Filament, you know, have to confront that reality and think about what context they want to be working within.
I'd also like to jump in and just say, you know, I think when we're talking about companies that are wanting to commercialize keystone medicines, I think that they also need to understand what keystone is, right? It's understanding that these medicines, right, are like the cornerstone of these traditional communities, you know? And I think going back to what we've talked about and like kinship and relational, right? Understanding that these medicines are family members. And Sandor Ironrope talks about this with peyote, right? We talk about one, the ecological, you know, issues that exist, but we also need to talk about when we are trying to commercialize the sacred, we extracting and exploiting someone's relative, right? They look at that peyote as a relative, right? And we're extracting from it. And so, you know, I hate to be assumptive, but I don't know that Indigenous communities want us to extract their grandmas. You know, I don't think that that's what communities want. And so I think that, you know, a consultation has to happen, you know, to really be able to understand. But in that consultation, you also have to be willing to listen. And what I see right now happening is this like greenwashing of reciprocity and this profit sharing that's happening without consultation. And I really think that benefit sharing without consultation is just another form of bribery.